Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first plenary of the Crossings and Connection Conference. My name is Jana Sverdljuk, and I am a researcher at the National Library of Norway. And I'm honored to moderate this plenary titled Norwegian Immigrants and Native Americans. Our speaker, Dr. Anna Petterson, is Associate Professor of History at Olaf College. She researches and teaches within the fields of immigration history, women's and gender history, social history, and indigenous history, with a geographic focus on Europe, Scandinavia, Norway, and the United States. Her current project sits at the nexus of immigration and indigenous history and explores the topics of gender, education, and ethnicity at the Norwegian-American-run Bethany Indian Mission outside Wittenberg, Wisconsin. Anna Petterson serves as editor for the Norwegian-American Historical Association, overseeing its robust journal and book publications program. It's both a special pleasure and an honor for me to take this role as moderator, as I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Anna Petterson during my time at Oslo University, specifically at the Center for Gender Studies. I fondly recall that period where Anna stood out as a person of great integrity and warmth. Her contributions have left a lasting impression on me, and I am excited to celebrate her work today.
Thank you, and good morning. It's a pleasure to follow the keynote address, which I think will serve as a lasting reminder that while I'm going to focus on the history of this topic, this history has a living legacy today. So the title of the talk is, What Do We Know About Norwegian Immigrants and Native Americans? And let me say this up front, the answer is not very much, or not as much as we could know, maybe not as much as we should know, and I think not as much as we can know. In terms of historiography, these topics have largely been written separately. A history of Norwegian immigration on the one hand, and an indigenous history on the other. But within the last 20 years or so, this has started to shift somewhat with the work of Betty Berglund, Orm Øverland, Karen Hansen, myself, and Gunlag Før, who focuses on Sweden and Swedish Americans. So while I didn't title this talk What We Don't Know About Norwegian Immigrants and Native Americans, I do think it important to emphasize that we actually know very little. What we know with any depth is centered around a few cases: Norwegians and the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, Norwegians on the Spirit Lake Reservation in North Dakota, and the Norwegian-American-run Bethany Indian Mission in Wisconsin. And these are the cases that I want to focus on this morning. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be covering. I also want to talk about the perceptions and attitudes toward American Indians present in Norway at the time of mass emigration, as well as what Norwegian immigrants had to say about Native Americans in the letters they wrote back home. Let's start with Norway. In completing research for my dissertation and book on the development of Norwegian maternity policies, I came across a speech the Member of Parliament, Dr. Ludvig Larsen Kragtorp, who was a member of the Venstre party, a speech that he gave in 1914, in which he conjured up the image of a North American Indian corralling livestock on horseback minutes after giving birth to open the parliamentary debate on paid maternity leave. Krogtorp used this vivid example to argue that while primitive women, in his words, might be able to, quote, ride into the nearest bush, give birth alone, and throw themselves upon the back of a horse with their newborn baby in their arms, such could not be expected of cultured peoples. This example shows the ways in which Native American peoples were firmly entrenched in the Norwegian imaginary and served as a powerful political argument to contrast the civilized with the uncivilized. By the time Krogtorp gave his opening address in 1914, Norwegian perceptions of Native Americans had been informed by nearly a century of popular portrayals of American Indians in Norway. Since the 1830s, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans had been available to a Norwegian audience as Den siste Mohikaner. Starting in the 1870s, mass emigration precipitated an immense interest in Western novels in Scandinavia, just at a time when increased literacy rates were creating a mass audience for leisure reading. As Ray Allen Billington writes, quote, "From that time on, the demand skyrocketed as boys from 8 to 80 escaped from shop and farm into the untamed forests and prairies of America, where myth and romanticism merged, unrestrained by reality." Billington quotes an Oslo author, Barnt Lie, as having stated in the 1890s, quote, "The gaudy pulps brought their boyish fantasies to a fever pitch, creating passionate, crimson dreams of war and spilled blood, and made it quite impossible to concentrate on such peaceful occupations as school and homework." They found their escapes in titles such as Wakandarera, the White Eagle, The Blood Drinker of Tonquah Taboo, or Gliding Snakes in the Primeval Forest. And if you're interested in knowing more about these, I'd start with Barnt Lie's Sorteorn og andre guttefortellinger, which was published in Oslo in 1894. These Indian stories were wildly popular. As Gunlag Fur has found in Sweden, by the mid-1880s, Swedish children were already familiar enough with notions of Indians to incorporate them into their play. And in 1900, more than 20% of books published for children in Sweden had an Indian motif. Selma Lagerlöf, who was awarded a Nobel Prize in Literature in 1909, even credited Mayne Reid's Osceola the Seminole from 1858 with inspiring her for wanting to become a novelist. Not only could Scandinavian readers regale themselves of Western novels that depicted Indians as bloodthirsty warriors and romanticized noble savages, in 1874, audiences in all three countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, could see a touring group of Pawnee live. During that year, 2 Swedish entrepreneurs had managed to get permission to go abroad with White Fox, Red Fox, and White Eagle of the Pawnee Nation. Pioneers of sorts of the kind of show Buffalo Bill Cody would become famous for, White Fox, Red Fox, and White Eagle put on performances in the Scandinavian capitals. Advertisements lured audiences by emphasizing wildness and authenticity. In Christiania, modern-day Oslo, the group performed at Klingenberg, moving from a smaller arena to a larger one, presumably as the audience numbers swelled. White Fox, Red Fox, and White Eagle stayed in Christiania longer than in any of the other places they went during the tour. Their popularity was reflected in a considerable number of great Indian balls held that summer across Norway. These were public dances with an American Indian theme. The Pawnee tour is perhaps most well known for the fact that while in Sweden, white fox became ill and died. A Swedish scientist laid claim to white fox's remains and dismembered the corpse, taking the skin off the head and torso and placing it on a plaster cast for public display at an exhibition. It wasn't until the 1990s that Sweden returned white fox's skin to the Pawnee Nation. The Swedish treatment of white fox was in line with Scandinavian ethnographic treatment of the Sami population, the indigenous peoples of that region. For example, in 1852, following the Kautokeino Rebellion, 2 Sami men who participated in the uprising were executed. While their bodies were buried outside the local church, their decapitated heads were sent away, became objects of research, and ended up in scientific collections. 5 years later, in 1857, the Ethnographic Museum opened at the University of Oslo, and of the 197 objects displayed, 3 of them were plastic casts of Sami men's heads, which you can see here. North American objects, including Indian artifacts from Minnesota, would come to be displayed alongside these depictions of Norway's indigenous population by the 1870s. With these parallels, it's important to remember that alongside the development of public fascination with American Indians was the playing out of fornorskningspolitik in the mid-19th century, which targeted the Sami and other minorities with official nationalist Norwegianization policy. These policies had a profound effect on Sami language, culture, and customs. To my knowledge, no research has been done as of yet to examine the ways in which perceptions of Sami affected Norwegian attitudes toward American Indians. But I feel it's safe to say that these perceptions must have played a role. For example, at the very same time Norwegian immigrants were claiming lands recently taken from Native Americans, the Norwegian government enacted a doctrine of state lands, which held that the state was the original possessor of the land, and thus owner of all lands to which no one could prove a title. The doctrine implied that unregistered land was fully owned by the state and not subject to any rights in favor of the local population, notably the Sami. Through reading about Native Americans in popular novels, seeing them perform live, and/or reading about these performances in newspapers, viewing ethnographic objects, and discussions of Norwegianization of the Sami, Norwegians formed impressions of Native Americans that would color the stances immigrants took when they encountered actual Native American people. It informed and influenced what they chose to remember and talk about. Much of what they believed Native Americans to be centered on Indians as people to be feared. Yet this picture was tempered by an understanding that the settlers who had participated in dispossessing Native Americans of their land were partially to blame for any Native American hostilities. And settlers, including Norwegian immigrants, did contribute to and benefit from the dispossession of Native peoples. During the same period that Norwegians were coming en masse to the United States, Native Americans were being forced, both by governmental policies and white settlement, to move from their traditional homelands to reservations located increasingly further west. As Native Americans were dispossessed of their lands, white settlers, including Norwegian immigrants, came to occupy these recently vacated territories. It's important to remember in this context the importance of land to Norwegian immigrants. As Betty Berglund has written, quote, "Norwegian migration to North America was predominantly a land-seeking and agricultural migration. Norwegians were the most rural of any immigrant group in the 19th century. And even as late as 1910, Norwegians were still located in small rural communities. Land was of preeminent importance to Norwegian immigrants and their descendants, both economically and culturally. For this reason, Norwegian immigrants benefited immensely from the federal policies that led to the dispossession and displacement of Native Americans, including the 1862 Homestead Act and the 1887 Dawes Act. Most people are familiar with the Homestead Act, but as a quick review, it accelerated westward expansion by granting adult heads of families 160 acres of public land for a minimal filing fee and 5 years of continuous residence on that land. The lands given under the Homestead Act were those recently ceded by American Indians as negotiating powers. In 1887, with the passage of the General Allotment Act, more commonly known as the Dawes Act, another vital advancement in the American imperial project of seizing and transforming North America took place. Under this act, reservation land, which belonged to tribes as sovereign nations, would be subdivided into individual lots. Adult heads of families were allotted private property of 80 acres. Children received 40 acres. By design, once tribal members received their own plots, the surplus of remaining lands were open for white homesteading. Partly due to the rural and agricultural nature of their migration, Norwegians had regular contact with Native Americans upon their arrival in the United States. From the 1840s and continuing through the 1930s, Norwegian immigrants settled on recently vacated Indian land, near Indian reservations, and in some cases, even on reservations. Within this context, the fact that Norwegian immigrants and American Indians encountered one another, and that Norwegian settlement in America depended upon appropriation of Indian land, seems obvious. Yet there's largely silence about this relationship between Native Americans and Norwegian immigrants in the historical sources. Immigrant letters, for example, have long been used to tell immigration historians about Norwegians' daily lives in the United States. But when it comes to mentions of Native Americans, they are noticeably absent. In his study of over 1,650 America letters, Orm Øverland found that only 47 of the 1,650 mention Native Americans, the majority of which were focused on the time period of the U.S. Dakota War. How can it be that so few letters contain references to Native Americans? Øverland argues that the writer's poor education and writing skills may have something to do with it, along with potentially the belief that it would be of little interest to the reader, or that the author didn't possess the language to describe the foreign environments they encountered, let alone the people. These practical obstacles may well have been the reason so few letter writers included Native Americans in their letters. But Øverland also quotes the Swedish novelist Sven Sverdljuk, who was born in an immigrant settlement in Manitoba in 1931. In his autobiography, Livets Ox, de Blanc wrote, "The Indians were, it must be admitted, not part of this immigrant community. One did not see them. I believe that one repressed their existence. I was surprised when I returned in my 50s and saw them everywhere. In my childhood and youth, I had not seen them." Øverland uses de Blanc's writing to argue that the silence of the letters reflects the invisibility of people who were uncomfortable reminders of the ethical ambiguities of immigrant homemaking. To emphasize this point, Øverland quotes Anand Mirben, who wrote in 1911 from southwestern North Dakota that his homestead was on what they call wild land that had not been lived on before. Letters like these might have left readers with the impression that the immigrants moved into areas without native populations, or that these populations had been removed before immigrants arrived and began staking their own claims to the land. But of course, that's not reflective of reality. Norwegian immigrants and their descendants encountered and interacted with Native Americans, especially in the early period of immigration, as a part of their daily lives, but even after, up through the 1950s, as a matter of course. I want to talk now about these three moments in history where the historical sources that recorded these interactions are prolific. Notably, these sources all detail events and interactions that took place in the Midwest. The first one I want to talk about centers on the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. First, a brief overview of this war. The first act of open violence happened in August 1862 when 4 Dakota men shot 5 white settlers. During the next month, more than 500 settlers and an uncertain number of Dakotas, though the number is likely similar to the number of white settlers, were killed before the Dakota surrendered to the U.S. Army at the end of September. So this took place over the course, really, of a month or so. In the aftermath, the U.S. government condemned 38 Dakota to death. They were publicly hung in Mankato, Minnesota. The U.S. imprisoned hundreds of others of Dakota at Camp McClellan in Davenport, Iowa, under horrific conditions until they were sent to a reservation in western Nebraska in 1866. 1 year later, they were forced to move again, this time to Dakota Territory. The conflict was concentrated in southwestern Minnesota, and some of the settlers killed were Norwegian. For example, open violence took place at the Bruberg and Lundberg homesteads in Kandiyohi County when Indians arrived and greeted the families as usual, but suddenly opened fire and killed 5 men. Other nearby settlers fled in terror, gathering on an island in Norway Lake. And over the next few days, they buried 13 bodies in a common grave. In all, 23 Norwegian immigrants died in the fighting, and Victor Lawson, who wrote extensively about Scandinavian settlements in the Kandiyohi region, was adamant that they had given the Indians no just cause for complaint or revenge. These immigrants were absolutely innocent of any wrong done to the red man. Though the historical causes of the war are varied and include such things as late annuity payments, the Civil War, and near starvation of the Dakota after crop failures, the ongoing encroachment of white settlers was certainly a reason for the outbreak of conflict. Countless newspaper articles were written in Scandinavia in response to the U.S. Dakota War. In addition, the U.S. consulate in Bergen issued a pamphlet alerting Norwegians to the conflict, and while laying out the facts, used language and tone to portray settlers as defenseless and Indians as cruel. Perhaps the most well-known Norwegian source for the U.S. Dakota War is a letter written by Guri Endresen. She wrote to her family in 1866, 4 years after the event in question, to report that all was well and that her trials were in the past. She wrote, I do not seem to have been able to do so much as to write to you, because during the time when the savages raged so fearfully here, I was not able to think about anything except being murdered with my whole family. During the conflict, 2 of her daughters had been captured by Dakota men, but were able to escape. One son was wounded and died later, and another one was killed. And she, quote, had to look on while they shot my precious husband dead. Guri returned to the area of her homestead in the same year she wrote her letter. She wrote optimistically of this decision, but stressed that, quote, the atrocities of the Indians are and will be fresh in memory. They have now been driven beyond the boundaries of the state, and we hope they will never be allowed to come here again. Even prior to Theodore Blegen discovering her letter during a research visit to Norway in 1928, Guri's story had been well circulated as a tale of bravery in the face of indescribable violence and loss. Orm Øverland believes that Guri's letter poses a challenge to the historian who wishes to describe the process by which land was wrested from one population group and resettled by another, and asks whether it is possible to retell this story of the U.S. Dakota War with dignity, humanity, and courage granted to the people on both sides. As a partial answer, Betty Berglund argues that, quote, we need to see simultaneously both the individual courage of Guri while rejecting the ideological formations embedded in the heroic narrative of savagery and conquest. Guri's letter has been digitized, and you can find it on NAHA's website if you're curious to read it. The Dakota's forced relocation to Dakota Territory provides a historical context for the next historical example of interactions between Norwegian immigrants and Native Americans that I want to discuss. Karen Hansen has studied, primarily through oral interviews, the process by which Norwegian and other Scandinavian homesteaders became neighbors of the Dakota on the Spirit Lake Dakota Indian Reservation in North Dakota. This situation was made possible by the Dawes Act, which allowed for the sale of reservation land to non-Indians after all Indian households had received their allotted acreage. At Spirit Lake, allotment to tribal members occurred from 1890 to 1892. Then in 1901, in accordance with the Dawes Act, the federal government negotiated with the tribal council to open unallotted land to white homesteading. Starting in 1904, the first Scandinavian settlers moved onto the reservation, and by 1929, Scandinavians came to dominate reservation lands as residents and farmers, owning fully 1/3 of reservation land, more than Dakotas themselves owned. Norwegian homesteader Helena Haugen Canton put it bluntly, quote, we stole the land from the Indians. In her study, Hansen notes similarities between the Dakota and Scandinavian immigrants. Both were dislocated from their homelands, and both groups had few resources during this period of time, sharing an equality of class circumstances. Both groups were also targets of Americanization and English-only campaigns, and tried to maintain their customs, languages, and religious practices in the face of these pressures. But Hansen is also quick to note that stark differences divided the Dakota and immigrants, including access to citizenship. The U.S. Constitution excluded Indians from citizenship until 1924, while white immigrants could be naturalized. And land ownership. Dakota's land remained in trust with the federal government, while Scandinavians could own their land outright. Over time, these differences offered Scandinavians and their descendants economic advancement, as well as a degree of inclusion in public life that remained inaccessible to Dakotas. On the reservation, Norwegian immigrants had to negotiate a space that was defined as Indian. In this space, they were outsiders. As Dakota elder Agnes Green put it, quote, "They got along with us." Her judgment conveyed her sense of who had to accommodate whom. Both groups were wary of one another, with the memory of the U.S. Dakota War and its repercussions fresh in their minds. Anticipating conflict made both groups apprehensive and their initial encounters fraught. Yet routine, and at times intimate interactions between them, calmed fears and made neighbors familiar with one another. This familiarity helped the Dakota and Scandinavian immigrants avoid conflict over things like differing norms of hospitality and gift-giving, as well as notions of private property. Lest we forget, Hansen reminds us that this sense of familiarity neither reversed dispossession nor established racial ethnic equality between the groups. I want to turn now to the third and last case demonstrating the relationship between Norwegian immigrants and their descendants and Native Americans, the Bethany Indian Mission, of which I've been focusing a lot of my research of late on. The guilt, or perhaps responsibility, Norwegian Americans felt over their role in the land taking was one of the primary motivations behind the founding of the Bethany Indian Mission in 1883. When Luther College graduate and recent immigrant from Norway, Evan Johnson Hami, implored the Norwegian Synod to start a mission to serve Native American tribes in Wisconsin, the Synod initially rejected his proposal. But 1 year later, they reversed their decision, stating, among other reasons for this change of heart, quote, "It is right to begin a mission among the Indians, since we occupy the land which was once their land, and we are obligated to them." Within a year, another Luther College graduate, Eric Olsen Morstad, had answered the call to serve as missionary, and the Bethany Indian Mission started its work in 1884. In operation from 1884 to 1955, fellow Luther College alums and first and second generation Norwegian immigrants followed Morstad in the deeply ambiguous work of offering religious and secular instruction to Native American tribes in Wisconsin. Their main group that they hoped to mission to were the Ho-Chunk, but also the Oneida, Stockbridge Munsee, Menominee, and Ojibwe peoples were involved. Notably, the Oneida and Ho-Chunk had divergent histories in Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunk at the mission were descendants of those who refused to leave their traditional lands in Wisconsin despite federal efforts to move them by force between 1830 and 1865. They did not have a reservation, but used the Homestead Act of 1862 to secure residence in the state. Ho-Chunk settlement in the state was and is concentrated around Black River Falls, Wittenberg, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin Dells, Tomah, and La Crosse. And you can see those Ho-Chunk settlements are kind of those ovals. And the star is where the Bethany Indian Mission was located. A member tribe of the League of Iroquois, the Oneidas migrated from their traditional homelands in New York to Wisconsin in the 1820s and 1830s, just as the federal government was beginning to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk. In contrast to the Ho-Chunk, the federal government recognized the Oneida's presence in Wisconsin in 1838 with a reservation along the Fox River near Green Bay. Prior to their settlement in Wisconsin, most Oneidas had already converted to Christianity due to the Oneida's early contact with Christian missionaries. Whites generally viewed them as more assimilated and civilized than the Ho-Chunk. And this perception was the source of much conflict at the mission. I have a list here of some of the major conflicts at the mission. There were conflicts between the synod that operated the mission and the federal government. During different periods of this history, the federal government actually ran the boarding school at the mission. At other times, the synod was responsible. And the synod reported wanting to Christianize Native peoples as their primary objective of running the mission, while they believed the government's main purpose was to civilize. We could also think of this as assimilate, and as talked about in the keynote address, erase Indigenous peoples. There were conflicts between the Norwegian Synod and other denominations, primarily over, again, having children attend the boarding school that the mission operated from the time of its origination in 1884 up until 1935. And I have that quote there that in one of the reports, the leaders of the mission are talking about how the Catholics say Bethany kids will go to hell. There were also conflicts between the people who ran the mission and the tribes and the people that they intended to serve. They talked about conflicts between them and old medicine men who were resistant to their efforts. They talked about conflicts between the people who ran the mission and parents of the children who attended the boarding school. They talked about conflicts between the people who ran the boarding school and the children themselves. Sometimes this was in terms of behavior. Often it was the case that there were many children, especially boys, who would run away from the boarding school, and that was a source of conflict. There was also a major conflict that happened in 1938, which after the boarding school closed in 1935, there was a new superintendent brought in, Ernest Seeler, who's also a Luther College graduate, but he was actually German-American. His father taught German at Luther College, and he became superintendent of the mission after the boarding school closed, and he had a lot of interactions with the Ho-Chunk that were not positive. And the Ho-Chunk in particular thought that he favored the Oneida, for example, over them. They listed a lot of instances where they felt that Seeler treated them inhumanely. They also complained of his German ancestry in conflict with the previous Norwegian-American superintendents of the mission. And they actually signed a formal petition in 1938 that they sent to the Norwegian Lutheran Church of America asking for Seeler to be removed as superintendent of the mission. That petition was not recognized by the church, and Seeler stayed in his position until the mission closed in 1955. So those are some of the conflicts that we can see. And I want to just briefly talk about some of the activities of the mission as seen through the photographs that they used in the promotion of the mission with a slideshow they created. And so all the images that I've been using in this presentation of the mission actually come from that slideshow that the mission created to promote their activities, to fundraise, especially in the 1950s. So this first picture is of David Thundercloud and mission worker, mission staff, Lucille Ackerson's wedding in 1951 at the Bethany Indian Mission's chapel. And starting way back in the late 19th century, one of the activities that the mission would report to the synod as evidence of what they called the fruits of their labor were intermarriage between Norwegian Americans and indigenous peoples. So we can kind of see that, again, kind of highlighting this as one of the positive effects of the mission, leading to intermarriage between, here we have a Ho-Chunk man and actually a member of the staff of the mission in 1951. Another major activity of the mission was selling Ho-Chunk baskets. And I'm actually going to talk about this in more depth on Saturday, so if you're interested in kind of the ways in which the mission facilitated basket sales for Ho-Chunk families, I'm going to talk about that on Saturday. But starting again in the late 19th century, Ho-Chunk women would come to the mission with baskets that they had made out of the black ash tree and ask the mission to buy them as a form of economic subsistence and economic activity, kind of in the off-season when they weren't engaged in agricultural labor. Primarily in the winter months, the Ho-Chunk would try to make some money by selling baskets. The mission then would buy these baskets and sell them primarily to ladies' aid organizations throughout the upper Midwest. These ladies' aid organizations would then sell them again to members of their church communities. And so basket sales was a very important role that the mission took on for its entire existence. Under Sealer, after this conflict happened in 1938, where the Ho-Chunk asked for his removal, the church refused to recognize that request. He stayed on. The boarding school had closed in 1935. That's a very long and complicated story that I won't get into now, but it closed at a time of great economic hardship for Native American peoples during the Great Depression, and many of these Native American families wanted the boarding school to remain open in the 1930s because they saw it as an economic resource to help their families, a place that they could send their children to go, where they would receive food and lodging, as well as an education. And the boarding school closing was then recognized as something that was very difficult for them. And part of the reason that they were resistant to Sealer, who came in and took over as superintendent at that time. And because the boarding school closed after he took over, and I would argue because he was looking for ways to mend relationships with these people who were very upset with his presence there, he started new programs to try to materially assist Ho-Chunk families from the 1930s then through the 1950s. And one of those projects was what he called the Adoption Project. And he facilitated relationships, again, with ladies' aid organizations, connected with the Norwegian Lutheran Church, where these ladies' aids would adopt primarily Ho-Chunk children who were going to then be going to public school since the boarding school closed. They adopted these children in the sense that they sent them school clothing. And so here you see Tony and Martha Whitewing with their packages that they've received in the mail filled with school clothing. He also instituted a summer school. We might think of it as a vacation Bible school, but it lasted throughout the summer months. And we see a picture here of the lunch table. This was a integrated summer school, so local white children attended alongside Native American children. There were also what they called clothing days, where they would sell clothing donated to them, again, primarily from ladies' aid societies, for a nominal cost to Native American families. And we see Mrs. Annie Little Wolf, Mrs. John C. Decora, and Mrs. Annie Hensley in this photo here. This photo is taken outside at one of these clothing days. And just as a note, Mrs. Little Wolf and Mrs. Decora were among the signatories of the petition calling for Sealer's removal in 1938. The last thing that I want to mention in terms of activities that Sealer pursued during the last 20 years of the mission's operation involved him facilitating relationships between children associated with the mission and Norwegian Lutheran colleges. During his time, he helped send and fund through the mission over 13 primarily Ho-Chunk youth college educations. Most of these students went to Luther College because of Sealer's connection to Luther, but there was one who transferred from Luther to St. Olaf, and one who also attended Pacific Lutheran in Washington. That was kind of helped through this initiative that he started. And so you see here in this picture, Angelina, she was known as Dolly Hapinka, who graduated from Luther College in 1953. And for those of you who attended the keynote, you might remember that Deidre talked about only 16% of Native peoples having bachelor degrees today. 9 of the 13 students Sealer helped send to college received their bachelor's degrees, and 2 of them actually went on to get PhDs, and this was in the late 1940s and 1950s. And so this was a really interesting project that Sealer kind of spearheaded, and I actually wrote an article about this because in the archives they kept all the correspondence between the students and Sealer, where the students talked about their experiences at these Norwegian Lutheran colleges. So these are just some examples of the activities the mission was involved in, and also gives you a sense of how they were promoting themselves and seeing themselves and the kind of activities that they were uplifting as evidence of their good work. But I wanted to highlight these as a way to show the close relationships that developed between Native Americans and Norwegian immigrants and their descendants that came as a result of the mission. These lasted at least until the mission closed in 1955, and perhaps one could argue still lasts to this day. So let me conclude the presentation there so that we have a little bit of time for questions. Through looking at the 3 cases of Norwegian immigrants and the U.S. Dakota War, the Spirit Lake Reservation, and the Bethany Indian Mission, as well as examining the context in which interactions between Norwegian immigrants and Native Americans in these cases occurred, I hope I've given you some understanding of what we know about the Norwegian immigrant experience with Native Americans. While much of the history of this topic has been marked by erasure, I feel confident in saying that we have entered a new era in scholarship on this topic, an era marked by reconsideration and new investigation. Thank you. So if anyone has a question, if you want to raise a hand, and she will come with a microphone.
Hello? I don't know who was the first. Okay. It's okay.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful talk. I learned much from it, but I did want to make a comment because in my book, Norwegian on the Prairie, and in my studies in Wisconsin, I have studied very carefully how Norwegians and Native Americans reacted. And what I found, which I want to comment on, that it occurred to me in the beginning that they showed, both sides showed their fellow humanity in the relationship. And in my book, then, the Norwegian on the Prairie, there was a very friendly relationship, and they visited each other and so forth. And in my studies in Wisconsin, I even found that Norwegian women giving birth had to help from a Native American woman to give birth. So there was a kind of human relationship. And what happened later, of course, was, especially as I study it in my book on Western Minnesota, was when the white population became too large, and then the Native Americans felt frightened from it. And then the relationship changed. And also, Norwegian farmers want to get rid of all the Native Americans they could. But to begin with, when they first met, there was a humanity that I think we also need to stress, that there was a fellow humanity between Native Americans and Norwegian Americans. That's all I have to say.
Yes, thank you. That's odd level up there, talking about some of the research that he has done on this topic. And I think, absolutely, right? And I think that Karen Hansen would agree with her study of Scandinavian homesteaders on Spirit Lake Reservation as well, about this shared humanity and familiarity and neighborliness, right, that these relationships exhibited.
Hi, Anna. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'm interested in complicating this only slightly. I'm struck in your quotation about the Catholics say that Bethany kids will go to hell. Wondering how much of that is Catholicism and non-Catholics. I mean, the Catholics believing that everybody who wasn't a Catholic would go to hell. I mean, I'm interested in how much is race, how much is religion, and wondering how that kind of plays out, or even how we might be able to think about that mix of those two things.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think you're right that there's a lot of layers to that. I think that I was, in what I've read from the archives of the mission, that most of this, at least, was seen from the Lutheran side as a denominational Protestant versus Catholic conflict, that it was a religious conflict, and that there was certainly competition amongst different religious denominations and practices over proselytizing to Native American tribes, and seen as some groups seeing themselves as being better at doing that than others. And I think that that is what I see mostly reflected in that quote.
In the interest of full disclosure, I would have